Great. Okay, then first of all, thanks to everyone who's joining our panel, and also, of course, to everyone who's been working really hard to make this conference happen at all. In my talk today, I will explore how a work of fiction actually uses Sino-Japanese or Kampo medical knowledge, and particularly the medical body. More specifically, I will focus on a 1799 Kibyoshi by Chupencha Iko, Hara no Uchi Yojo Shuron, or the essentials of healthy living inside the body. And this makes explicit reference to the discourse of health cultivation, or Yojo in Japanese. As such, I'm going to argue that Iko's work and similar health-related works of fiction represented a response to claims on the body that circulated in 18th century medical, moral, and educational discourses, and that images of the body, health, and disease served fiction writers as satirical commentaries on traditional learning, morality, and society. Now, Kibyoshi have traditionally been judged to have entered their period of decline in the 1790s, cut off at the stem by government censorship after the Kansei reforms. But space for satire could still be opened up within certain parameters, and medical themes provided one such avenue for fiction writers in the 1790s. What some literary scholars thus deplore as a symptom of the decline of late 18th century Kibyoshi, that is, that they turn to more serious and educational themes, makes them in fact particularly illuminating for the scholar of cultural studies and the historian. From such a vantage point, they become yet another expression of the circulation of knowledge in print, and can serve as a repository of what medical historian Roy Porter has famously called the patient's view on health, disease, and body. Now, the way in which I intend to bring medicine and literature together is via the concept of illness metaphor, or metaphor more generally. Now, metaphor and medicine may intuitively seem irreconcilable counterpoles. Medicine as a science, which obviously purports to relate hard facts, clashes with our common sense notion of metaphor as a fanciful flourish more appropriate to literary forms of expression. But medical discourses, past and present, are in fact rife with images and underlying metaphorical styles of thinking about the body. Historians, sociologists, and medical anthropologists have begun to explore how pervasively such metaphors and images surrounding the body and disease in fact shape people's representations, perceptions, and experience of them. Metaphorical strategies are also very familiar to us, of course. So, of course, we still, for example, hail new medications as bullets in the war against cancer, etc. Metaphors play a part in forming new theories among experts, but they also make sense for patients who use them to make sense of their own physical experiences. And early modern Japanese medical discourse was no exception in that respect. In pre-modern Japan, there was, needless to say, no direct correspondence to the term and concept of the metaphor. But at the same time, this does not mean that there was no metaphorical use of language. So, for example, particularly similes, which express a comparison or likeness between two things, were fairly common. Early modern health cultivation texts, which were aimed at a general readership, for example, made frequent use of metaphorical figures as a means of providing accessible illustration of medical processes for the non-expert readers. So, for example, as you see in the slide here, they would compare the sexual vitalities in the human body to the oil in a lamp, which can all too easily run out. And that would, of course, the point of that would, of course, be to highlight the need for sexual moderation by using this like everyday process or object to explain why that would be the case. But metaphorical strategies in medicine were not only confined to a lay public. In fact, expert discourses in Sino-Japanese medicine were also rich in figurative language that was originally imported from other non-medical fields. So as an example, on the left here, we've got the idea of the various organ systems in Kampo medical thought, which were the so-called gozo, so the 5 organs. these were compared or defined as the body's storehouses, as in a very common trope. And you see the example here comes from the Wakansanzai, an early 18th century encyclopedia. And as an explanation for the organs, it simply says "so wa koronari." So the organs are storehouses. And this image reflected in fact, the fundamental understanding of how the organs functioned in Sino-Japanese medicine, namely as kinds of depots stocking the body's different vitalities. This metaphor had in fact already appeared in the foundational classic of Chinese medicine, the so-called Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, which dates to the 2nd century BC. In fact, the historian of Chinese medicine, Paul Unschold, has previously argued that medical thinkers at that time used elements of the newly unified Han state, such as indeed storehouses and granaries, in order to label and explain the different functions of the body. One dominant metaphor that was inherent in Sino-Japanese medical discourses virtually from its inception was therefore the body as a state or society en miniature, which is also particularly relevant in view of the Edo representations in fiction, as we shall see. Another common trope was that of the body as a cosmos on miniature. So you see that on the right-hand side here. And this linked physical structures of the body to macrocosmic natural features around them. So for example, the head would be compared to heaven, and the feet to earth, the bones to rocks, etc. And ultimately this way of conceptualizing the body also derived from Sino-Japanese medical theory, which placed the body as a microcosm within the larger macrocosm of the universe. Now, it was precisely this kind of metaphor-laden medical discourse in the Kampo tradition, which late 18th century Kibyoshi mined in order to create entertainment and social satire. And the example you see here comes from Santo Kyoden's Kotai wa Go Monogatari. And in that illustration, Kyoden depicts himself as he's lecturing on the received knowledge of the body. And in the background, one finds these collection of surreal structures like hair grass and pulse river. And these, of course, represent visual puns on these microcosm, macrocosm analogies in medical thought. What enabled this lively cross-current of images between medical discourses and fiction in the first place was, of course, the unprecedented dissemination of medical ideas in early modern Japan. The commercial book market at that time produced a host of consumer-oriented medical publications for a lay readership, which included not only health manuals, but also compendia of materia medica, prescription books, and medical household encyclopedias. But medical themes did not only proliferate in printed reference works, they also became a recurring topos in popular vernacular fiction, which does arguably form one end on the spectrum of the circulation of medical knowledge. This could range from adventurous imaginary journeys into the ailing body to fictional accounts explaining the workings of certain diseases, such as smallpox narratives or syphilis war tales. But today I'm going to focus on one of a set of works which turned the medical body, its parts and processes into a fictional setting and into actors driving the plot. In the 1790s, at least 3 such works appeared, which used this approach as a primary plot device. And later that trope was then revived in the 1850s, among others in the popular Yojo Kagami prints. Now, what is particularly interesting about Iko's Essentials of Healthy Living is its explicit reference to health cultivation discourses, or Yojo, and to see how this translates into a work of fiction. Although, as I will also show, it was by no means a mere transposition of medical knowledge into a fictional mode. This particular work is currently extant in 5 copies, and in the slide you see the cover from the National Diet Library version. and then the illustrated Dice and Slip from the middle volume, which is still preserved at Tokyo Metropolitan Library. Here you see the preface on the left, which is dated spring of Kansei 11 or 1799. The publisher we can also identify from his publisher's mark as Nishimuraya Yohachi, who was one of the leading publishers of popular literature and prints in Edo at that time. And at the end of the book, Iko is then also identified as the illustrator, and the ambulant bookseller that is depicted kind of provides another roundabout clue at the publisher, because he, of course, sports Nishimuraya's Yago, his shop name, Ejudo, on his bundle of books. In the title of his work, Iko obviously already very consciously makes reference to the early modern concept of health cultivation, and by extension also to the printed genre of health cultivation texts. Whether this titular Yojo Shuron referred to a specific health manual, however, seems doubtful. So a manual by this name had actually been published in 1683 by a Kyoto physician named Nagoya Genni, but Iko's actual inspiration appears to have been the early 18th century scholar Kaibara Ekiken, whom he cites on several occasions in his text. And you see examples of this on the slide. And I think it is pretty obvious that even though Iko purports to or claims to quote from a book named Yojo Shuron, or an unidentified Isho, an unidentified medical text, that the textual similarities show that he's actually lifted it from Kaibara Ekiken's Yojo-kun. In addition, a rather unique feature of the Essentials of Healthy Living is that Ekiken actually appears as a character in the narrative frame, which makes this work also noteworthy in terms of this iconic scholar's Edo period reception and the afterlife of his work. And you see Ekiken here on the right-hand side. The Essentials of Healthy Living opens with a fictionalized version of Iko as an idle and very uncouth fellow who, quote, had the urge to eat everything he laid his eyes on. Iko's insatiable appetite has taken its toll on his health, so that he's no longer able to write any of his illustrated books. And then one day he dozes off and he has a strange dream, which of course sets in motion the common device in Kibyōshi of the dream narrative. Somewhat unusual in this case, however, is the inclusion of a medical viewpoint on dreams, namely the notion that dreams are a suffering of the 5 organs, or gozo no wazurai. In Chinese medical thought, dreams were generally believed to be of diagnostic value in pointing the doctor towards the cause of disease. And Iko's story reflects this notion in both text and image, as the personified dream leads the illustrious medical expert Kaibara Ekiken inside Iko's body to diagnose the disease and heal him from within. And you can see them both here, how they're hopping in. In such ways, non-narrative fragments of medical knowledge are woven into the text in the form of proverbs or direct quotations from medical works, which at the same time then become narrative building blocks that drive the plot. Okay, so what specifically actually qualified Ekiken to feature as the expert guide to the inner workings of the body in Iko's work? Ekiken was a polymath, as we know, but in terms of medicine and health, his reputation mostly relied on his 1713 Yojo-kun, which is arguably the best-known Edo period health cultivation text. It was kind of prototypical of that genre of texts, in that it was, first of all, written in a relatively accessible vernacular, aimed at a lay audience, and steeped in Confucian didacticism. That Iko should have drawn inspiration from Ekiken's Yojo-kun, despite more than 80 years having elapsed since its initial publication, is not really that surprising. Yojo-kun saw at least 13 dated editions by the end of the Edo period, which is more than any other health cultivation text. For the work's 100-year anniversary in 1813, the publisher even launched a an extended version, and you can see the ad for that new edition here. And this was amended by a substantial appendix, which then went on to be reproduced in all late Edo editions. The audience of such health cultivation text was also by no means limited only to the warrior elite, and early modern book catalogues, for example, show that the upwardly mobile reading commoner strata by the early 18th century already owned such books. It is therefore safe to conclude that Yojo-kun was a widely known example of health cultivation texts at the time that Iku was writing. Now, how precisely did Iku use this intertextual reference point in his work? In its narrative progression, we can say the work brilliantly parallels elements of Ekiken's text and health discourses more generally. As we enter this dream narrative, the personified body parts act out the do's and more commonly the don'ts of healthy living. And they demonstrate the putative effects of an unhealthy lifestyle on the body. Iku's fictional body is thrown into the disarray of disease as a result of his gluttony. And that was, of course, a vice that was constantly discussed in medical discourses as a major factor in health cultivation. Ekiken, in particular, emphasized the importance of controlling inner desires, what he called naiyoku, and cited overindulgence in food, sex, and sleep as triggers for disease. Accordingly, Iku's dream narrative, which illustrates the effects of overeating on the body, casts the senses as the body's saboteurs. The nose, the mouth, the eyes, which represent Iku's voracious desire for food, become the unlikely villains and scheming to wreak havoc on the body in the narrative. And you can see them here plotting away how they're going to make Iku eat more and more instead of holding back. Only once these villains are suppressed in what metaphorical fight that you can see here, can peace and order return to the body. Now, the second great desire of health cultivation that Iku metaphorically represents in his narrative is sex. Overindulgence in which was, of course, also believed to be harmful to health. In Iku's fictional body, essence, which you see in the right here, which was essentially the sexual vitality that was stored in the kidneys, according to Kampo thought, and original ki or genki, so the life energy that one received from one's parents at birth. So these two, essence and genki, appear as a pair of love-struck youngsters, and they embark on a passionate affair until their nightly tete-a-tetes begin to take their toll on them, which then, of course, reflects the Kampo belief that frequent sex drained the kidney's sexual fluids and caused a host of wasting symptoms. Such symptoms would eventually lead to a grave medical condition, which was called depleted kidneys and moving fire, or Jinkyo Kado. And as you can see in the slides, the way Iku chooses to represent this is the personified kidneys being essentially battered by an anthropomorphized fire. This story arc replicates the magical logic of sexual exhaustion, but at the same time, slippery puns and sexual innuendo abound in the text, which replaces and kind of undermines the sober Confucian propriety that normally underpinned the health discourses. At the end of the narrative, Ekiken then reappears like an apparition from a pile of Iku's vomit, and exhausts him to be more careful with his health in the future. And in the very last folio that we already briefly saw earlier, we can see the riches that are born from a healthy and hardworking body, represented as a shower of gold coins falling from the sky. And this last image, of course, stands in stark contrast with the ailing Iku that we see in the very first image, and ultimately conveys a rather simple message that equates health with good fortune and disease with poverty. Okay. Yet despite the fact that Iku's fictional tale present some basic medical notions about the body and disease, it would also not do this multi-layered work justice to consider it merely as an entertaining version of health discourses. Iko presents himself in the end as a merry transgressor of health guidelines, and he uses the cloak of medical propriety to portray a tumultuous social body of the late 18th century, inclusive of love affairs, profligate sons being disowned, etc. And ultimately, he also, for the largest part of the book, he satirically inverts the titular notion of health cultivation. So these organs that he depicts are not yojo, they are fu-yojo, really. Referring back to centuries-old metaphors of the body state or body society, Iko transforms the body into a thoroughly up-to-date social microcosm. And in the initial scene of Iko's dream narrative, for example, the reader is confronted with the heart presenting as a general or taisho over the other four organs, the spleen, the liver, the lungs, and the kidneys as his official and vassals. This was actually a pun on the ancient saying that the heart is the body's master, which was once again a principle that ultimately derived from the metaphorical jargon of the Yellow Empress canon again, and explained the special position of the heart within the body and stressed its importance. These socio-political metaphors, as they were used in medical thought, so things like the heart as a leader and the other organs as subordinates, are then projected back onto the social plane in Iko's text and applied to Tokugawa hierarchies, essentially reversing the original metaphorical process that we find in medical texts. On a medical level, Iko resorted to the Kampo body and its notion of the 5 organs. Of course, this was despite the influx of novel anatomical insights at that time, but the organ's textual and visual representations in the kibyoshi are virtually identical to Kampo depictions in contemporary medical household books. So if we compare the kibyoshi to Ido Nichiyo Komoku, for example, as I've done here, which was one of the most popular medical household books at the time, you can very clearly see the parallels. Turning the body into a melting pot of mostly non-too-virtuous human activity, all these works created, or at least Iko's work in this case, created a body society that was to an extent messy, struggling, unruly and dysfunctional, and a far cry from the eponymous ideal of healthy living or yojo, which at the same time also evoked connotations of social order. What's also important to keep in mind at the end of the day is that linking an individual's health and that of society was significantly much more than a mere fictional trope. In fact, it was a core belief in various medical, educational, and didactic discourses which targeted the body in the 18th century. And there's particularly 2 streams that stand out here, namely health cultivation and shingaku, or mind learning. And I think that such fiction therefore needs to be situated in relation to these moral claims on the body. This is also abundantly clear once again if we look at the intertextual web that Iko's kibyoshi evokes, which not only quoted from health cultivation texts, or well, specifically the Yojokun, but also from shingaku works. So you see 2 examples here of the quotations that are taken from a popular shingaku work, even though Iko does not mark them as quotations in his texts. They are clearly lifted from shingaku mottos that were circulating at the time. Now, health cultivation was in fact closely intertwined with ethical values. So this is something that we have to understand from the get-go. To some extent, this reflected the understanding of healing in the Kampo medical tradition, because this integrated both body and mind and the physical and morals. In this system, physical ailments could be traced back, as I already mentioned, to inner desires and a lack of care in one's lifestyle, such as in one's diet and sex life. This meant that diseases then also carried certain moral implications and reflected a person's ethical conduct. And health cultivation texts very often projected moral values onto the body as being healthy, and kind of represented a somaticized form of didacticism, which validated ideals such as hard work, frugality, and moderation. So rather than being separate concerns, healthy morals and healthy living often coincided in these texts. So to give you an example, Ekiken, for example, argued that conforming to one's station in life and working hard at one's household trade was an a priori form of health cultivation. And overall, we can say that he very squarely placed a healthy body within a wide-ranging Neo-Confucian ideology of society. In this way, medical notions of cultivating life ultimately sought the integrity of body, ethics, and society. But health cultivation was not the only context which kind of discursively merged physical, social, and moral concerns. In the second half of the 18th century, Shingaku also fashioned the body into a site of self-discipline and incorporated certain ideas about physical cultivation in its program of moral edification. Shingaku rapidly gained followers in Edo throughout the 1780s and 1790s, and this surge of interest, which we know did not go unnoticed in the world of satirical fiction. So we might think of Santo Kyodan's popular Shingaku series here. Shingaku's inclusion of the body in its range of cultivation practices is also evident, for example, in this short, punchy moral motto that you see on the right-hand side here. And this proclaimed cultivation of the mind, cultivation of the body, cultivation of the household, kokoro no yojo, mi no yojo, ie no yojo, positing essentially a continuum of disciplining the self, mind, body, and society. What's also really important in this context is that Shingaku's teaching rhetoric, which was very heavily reliant on parables and metaphors, fueled a particularly rich metaphorics as medicine as a kind of morality. And you see two examples here. So essentially they were steeped in these kind of medical tropes of social illnesses or ills and moral afflictions, and virtues were presented as cures. So the example you see on the left-hand side here, for example, is a miraculous medication for a prosperous household. And on the right-hand side, you've got a medical billboard for something called patience pill. So the patience is here kind of touted as a kind of cure for a person's moral ills, so to speak. This then also went so far that there were certain single sheet prints which posed as fake medical advertisements. And they really imitated the style and format of leaflets for patent medication. So at first view, this really looks like a medical advertisement, but the content of it is entirely didactic and moral, and indeed presenting presenting patients as a cure for humanity. Okay, so in conclusion, or to conclude, kibyoshi that represented the medical body's inner workings have to be interpreted, as I contend, within this larger trend towards using the body as a kind of moral ideology, which came to be parodied in various ways in fiction. And such fiction kind of exploited far-reaching metaphorical networks of the body as a type of society, and co-opted this ongoing conflation of the body's physical, social, and moral health as it already existed in medical and educational discourses. But of course, in the end, echoed their rhetoric to an ultimately rather different effect. While contemporary notions of health cultivation and Shingaku teachings used the physical body as a natural canvas upon which they inscribed rather rigid moral and social norms as being conducive to good health, fiction was much more ambiguous in the meanings it conveyed and used the body as a setting for irreverent social commentary. The veneer of respectability borrowed from medicine and educational discourses kept the threat of censorship at bay, while at the same time opening up a certain space for ridicule and, most of all, entertainment. Previous research has placed this opening up of the body in fiction within the context of the rise of a Western-style anatomical gaze during the 18th century. But we should also not overlook the fact that many portrayals of the medical body by fiction writers and artists were still very much beholden to the Campo medical tradition and make virtually no direct reference to Western style medicine. While the increased interest in anatomy may well have provided an impetus for engaging with the inner workings of the body, my contention is that yellow cover books, especially those published in the 1790s, rather represented a response to indigenous medical, moral, and educational discourses in which the body had risen to the forefront of attention and had become a target of regulatory practices. A close reading of Iku's text and similar works by his contemporaries, together with an analysis of the sources that they drew on, clearly indicates that fiction writers in the 1790s actively engaged with such discourses. Notions of health cultivation and the popular moral teachings of Shingaku in particular made the body an arena for inscribing social norms. But in fiction, it also became a site for resistance and tongue-in-cheek entertainment. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Doreen now.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. This one. Okay, I hope you can see everyone. I'm going to take around 20 minutes, so there will be time for questions. We are looking forward to your questions, and thanks very much for staying until the end, I hope. I'm going to move the discussion now to the 19th century. And like Angelika said, satire didn't stop with the increasing censorship in the 18th century. And I actually want to argue that the particular field of fire satire actually flourished very much in the 19th century. I'm going to give you a little sort of introduction from the cultural perspective, and then I will focus on popular visual culture. So as everyone knows, 19th century Edo was a very precarious environment to live in. Fires were frequent, and actually they were a seasonal occurrence because they were particularly bad in the winter, which coincided with the last 2 months of the old year and the first 2 months of the new year. So for people in Edo, this was a seasonal occurrence, and winter was a time when they had to be particularly vigilant. And in Edo, we have very sophisticated culture of fire vigilance, which is summarized under the umbrella term hinoyojin. You can see this on the left here. And hinoyojin, just like Angelika said, with the medical knowledge, was actually a very complex field. That was instrumentalized in various ways. So on the one hand, hinoyojin was a serious matter of constant admonishment. For example, just to give you some examples, notices by the city magistrate constantly reminded people to be vigilant about fire. And then we also have, especially in the winter months, these Toby firemen would go around the neighborhoods and they would do wooden clappers and they would sound hinoyojin, hinoyojin. So this kind of thing was on everyone's mind. And in addition, there was a very sophisticated broadsheet culture that constantly reported illicitly on these fires. And most of these illicit fire reports were ended with the exclamation hinoyojin. Okay. And then I'm going to show you the next slide. Let me see. So on the right, you can see a backstreet tenement, and these tenants living in the back streets, they would put a hinoyojin slip above the fire stove to constantly remind them. And the image you see on the left, that is a luxurious hanging scroll that was painted by Suzuki Kiitsu for a wealthy merchant. And these kind of scrolls would have been put in the tokonoma in the new year. To pray for a prosperous new year. So for people in Edo, being vigilant about fire was pretty much a source of prosperity. So this is kind of the field of what we might call social cultural practices. But then on the other hand, hinoyojin also entailed a celebratory attitude towards practices of fire prevention and mitigation, and particularly in the field of popular visual culture. These fire prevention and mitigation measures, they were represented in such a way that they constructed a self-image of Edoites as kind of brave and disaster resilient. And this happened at all levels of cultural production. We can see this in Kano school paintings that were produced for daimyo and for wealthy merchants, but we can also see this in mass-produced popular prints and in illicit broadsheets. Just to give you a few examples, these are popular prints from the late Edo period, so they date from the 1850s, 1860s, and on the left we see a fireman from the Yo troop, and he is supposed to protect all the neighborhoods that are listed behind him. And on the right, the designer went even a step further, and he kind of implied that these commoner fire brigades, these machibikeshi, they don't just protect their neighborhood, but they protect the entire city. And this print depicts New Year celebrations when they would perform these desomishiki, right? And we can't see Edo Castle, it's hidden beneath trees, and the firemen reach almost as high as Mount Fuji. So these prints, they kind of convey a celebratory attitude that kind of shows firemen as auspicious things that keep the city safe and prosperous. However, we should not take this stuff at face value, right? As we have already seen in the first two presentations, people in the Edo period were very cynical and critical towards representation in general. So we cannot assume that contemporary viewers just took these at face value. And indeed, this self-image of Edoites as resilient and brave, it was constantly satirized, especially in the 19th century. And I want to argue in this paper that this kind of knowledge ecology of Hino-yojin incorporated everything. It incorporated celebratory representation, satirical representation, and also this kind of moralizing, serious admonishment. And all of this came kind of together. So I want to argue that the satire, the purpose of satirizing this image was not necessarily to destroy it, but rather to be almost complementary and to add a more critical perspective on the self-image. And I will try to prove this now. I only have space for 2 examples, okay? So please don't be too harsh. I'm going to show you a fire scroll that was painted by the Kano school and the broadsheet. So these are going to be my 2 lonely case studies to try to argue this. Okay, so here you can see a scroll that's in the collection of Matsuda Shiryo Hakubutsukan. That was painted around 1803. So the researcher Ueno Kaori, she has done extensive research on these fire scrolls. She's calling them kachiemaki because according to her, they were rather fictional. And all of these scrolls go back to one of the largest blazes in Edo, which was the Meiwa era fire of 1772. So this was probably one of the first instances when the Kano school started memorializing these large blazes. And being Kano school painters, once they have established a model, they keep it. So the same stuff was painted again and again until well into the 1860s. So by the 19th century, what is depicted in these Kano scrolls was to some extent outdated. But to some extent, that did not matter because the main function of these scrolls was ideological. On the one hand, it is believed that people would have viewed these scrolls, particularly in the winter, right? Because that's the time when the fires are frequent. So in order to remind themselves, we must be vigilant about fire. Okay, let's look at how terrible fire is. Let's look at this scroll. But according to Ueno Kaori, this serious admonishment of Hino-yojin was only a pretext. Or like Angelica said in the previous presentation, it was a cloak. And what these scrolls actually did was to provide entertainment. They provided a visual spectacle, and they kind of celebrated this boisterousness and resilience of Edoites in the face of recurring disaster. And Ueno, she also argues that this repetitive stereotypical representation and the humorous elements that were already contained in the Kano scrolls, that they were really conducive to satirical comments. If you have a look at the top section here, you can see this person is not a fireman. He's just a person trying to show off. So he's performing this dangerous stunt on the ladder, which has nothing to do with fighting the fire. Okay, so the Kano school scrolls, they were full of these kind of peripheral genre elements. And yeah, this started to get satirized. And we actually have an example dating to 1803. Hosedo Kisanji, who worked for the daimyo of Akita domain and who was a popular Gesaku author, he is believed to have written comments on an existing Kano scroll, satirical comments in the style of a Kibyoshi book. Unfortunately, the original work is no longer extant, but we have an 1860 copy, which is now in the Mitsui Bunko. And yeah, his comments, they kind of pick up the humorous elements that are already contained in the Kano scroll, and they take them further. And rather than just increasing the humor, they actually add a more moral dimension in some respects. And in the comments he writes there, he takes two different subject positions. One subject position is that of the critical viewer. He on occasion directly criticizes the painting. And he also takes another subject position, which is he takes the first person perspective of peripheral motifs that don't make much sense in the original painting. For example, he comments on the storehouse and on birds that are just decorative motifs and a tree. So he kind of, you might say he disrupts the pictorial narrative, but you could also argue he takes it to a sort of deeper moral level. And I want to give you a few examples now. So this, I like this one, sorry. The Kano scrolls, they don't actually show the worst of the fire. They show the fire as a kind of cyclical disaster that starts with discovery, overcoming, and eventual recovery and return to normalcy. And the worst of the fire is kind of elliptically indicated through these raging flames. So the viewer was supposed to imagine by themselves, okay, this is the worst of the disaster. And this scene ends with this burned up tree. and Kisanji, maybe he thought it a good idea to actually convey some of the trauma that is glossed over in the actual narrative. And the tree is basically scared of dying. He's like, oh no, please someone help me. And I want to become Fudomyo. And okay, so it kind of adds, yeah, a different dimension to the narrative. And then he does the same with this bird. In the scroll painting itself, it doesn't really make much sense, this bird. It's just a decorative motif. But he uses this, Kisanji in his comments, uses this bird as a mirror of the kind of opportunistic behavior of people. So this particular bird, he enjoyed the spectacle of the flames, and then he was rudely brought down back to reality because he realized, oh, I have to worry about my next meal. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of yeah, it adds another dimension to the narrative. And then a large section of these scroll paintings is actually dedicated to the rebuilding of the city in the immediate aftermath of the fire. So in this scene, you can see that even though the city has burned down and some of the storehouses here have been destroyed, people are starting to rebuild immediately. So you can see the lumber being brought, these temporary shelters being erected. So it's kind of, okay, they are immediately ready to recover immediately. But Kisanji's comments, they refocus the attention of the viewer on the actual destruction. And Angelika talked about a storehouse. I have a store. And there's a body metaphor here because this storehouse isn't up to the job, and actually it's scared of the fire. Storehouses, and especially the white plaster that protected the storehouses, was meant to protect the contents from fire. But this storehouse is saying, I'm a non-drinker, so whenever I drink sake, I turn bright red immediately. So it's kind of excusing itself. Okay, so it's very funny. And then there are also elements in Kisanji's comments that directly criticize the pictorial representation. Like here on the left, you can see this stuntman performing this unnecessary leather stunt. And basically Kisanji is saying this is a big waste. It's a useless spectacle. It's not helping the actual firefighting. In the background, you have these commoner fire brigades. They are orderly and they are about to douse the fire. And this guy is just taking everyone's attention away. So what his comments are showing is his satire is critical of the representation, right? And his comments show that these kind of scrolls were not just viewed at face value. When we, I don't know, we modern people, we are always kind of innocent, right? When we look at something, a picture or a photograph, we tend to take it at face value. But people in the Edo period apparently did not do that. So yeah, he was very critical of this representation. And I'm going to get to my second example, to the field of broadsheets. Now, these two fields, the scrolls and the broadsheets, they might seem totally unrelated, but actually in terms of how they evoke this culture of Hino-yojin as a serious register, as a register of cultural customs, and as a register of satire, they do that as well, just in different ways to the scrolls. So just to explain this broadsheet a little, quite a few major fires in the Bunka Bunsei eras in the first half of the 19th century, they started around Kanda River. So this one started north of Kanda River in Sakumacho neighborhood and spread westwards, so southwards. And you can see that this river was useless, right, in preventing the spread of fire, because this fire was carried by the wind. Flying sparks made it across the river and set alight the rest of the city. So many such broadsheets were issued in the course of these fires because they often lasted over several days. So alongside the event of the actual fire, you have the continuous issuing of broadsheets, and they constituted an event in themselves. And the representation of the fire in the broadsheets merited attention in its own right. It's not just the fire that people were concerned about, but also its representation in the broadsheets. So this particular broadsheet shows, it starts with Sakumacho neighborhood, and then Nihonbashi Bridge is here. So the sparks jumped the river, and then they set alight a granary, and then they reached down all the way to Edo Bay here. And this fire, of course, merited a lot of attention. There are lots of records of it in diaries. For example, Matsuda Seisan, he commented on it in his Kashiyawa. And he also hand-copied this broadsheet into his Kashiyawa. So this happened a lot as well. And what I find interesting is that even though the text down here describes the big damage that was done to the fire, and they give the, how many daimyo residences burned up, how many townhouses burned up. But if you look at the map itself, it doesn't really indicate the fire. What it actually does is it shows the resilience of Edo, that this basic structure of the waterways, the canals and the rivers stayed the same. And the fire is just a recurrent event that blows over the city, and the city remains regardless of this kind of disaster. So, but at the same time, if you look at the broad field of these broadsheets, we can also see satirical broadsheets. And I want to show you this one. This is in the collection of Tokyo University Library. And it shows 24 cartouches. All of these are Kyoka comic verse, which are based on the Hyakunin issue. And they kind of use this clash between the court poems and the Kyoka poem to kind of reveal these human frailties hidden beneath the image of Edoites as disaster resilient. So if you just have a look at some of these, yeah, this poem here refers to Kanda River again, and it refers to this sublime spectacle that if you look at a fire from far away, it's nice, right? It's kind of, it's like watching the fireworks, as long as it doesn't affect your own neighborhood. But yeah, when you get closer, you can actually see, oh no, the fire might be nice to watch from afar, but actually what it does, it turns the city into a field of ashes. So it's kind of this clash between fire as spectacle and then the sobering reality of destruction that comes with it. Yeah, these are these two cartouches. And then there's another very interesting cartouche that kind of parodies this New Year custom of the court, the picking of young pine shoots. This is a poem by Emperor Koko Teno. And it kind of likens this activity of picking young pine shoots to picking nails from the ashes to sell for your own profit. So it's kind, yeah. I don't know how you want to call this. Is it cynical? Is it critical? It's, yeah, Edo satire. And yeah, so this kind of opportunistic behavior was one thing that some people benefited or profited from the disaster, but there are also people that could sink even lower than that. Usually after a fire occurred, the authorities would provide relief hostels. They are called Osukui Goya. And the most vulnerable people would find shelter, food and medicine there. And this broadsheet closes with this sentence, right? Oh, the lovely authorities, they are so kind, they are providing these relief hostels. But this satirical broadsheet provides a different perspective on this, because it says, oh, these people are pathetic, they should make an effort, right? They should they should recover by themselves, right? So there are different opinions on this kind of relief, on these relief measures. So if you just look at the field of broadsheets, there were kind of heterodox opinions, views on opportunism and all these things. Okay, and no one was safe from being satirized. So they satirized the commoners, the townspeople, but they also satirized the samurai, of course. So here we have a member of a samurai fire brigade. He is running away rather than being loyal to his master. And the fire watchman, just like the storehouse, that's scared of the fire. He's scared of the dog. Okay. So yeah. So rather than what Alessandro said, he talked a lot about political satire. What I find in the field of fire satire is that it's kind of democratizing in a way, because everyone was subjected to it. It's not just a criticism of the government. It's basically a sobering of this exuberant self-image of Edoites as disaster resilient. And yeah, it's difficult to position satire. What does satire actually do in the context of a very serious business, the serious business of disaster? On that note, fires in Edo were a special kind of disaster because it was currently recurring, right? It was almost a seasonal event. So in that sense, in the field of this popular visual culture, fire became kind of normalized and internalized as part of the identity of Edoites. And I think the satire was part of that, rather than disrupting this image. So yeah, yeah.